Hello again, Peter Zion here, coming to you from Colorado with our holiday series on the workforce and economic trends and what's going on in the global system. Today, we're going to talk about two much maligned or much celebrated, based on your point of view, generations, specifically the Millennials and the Zoomers. Now, those of you who have been following me for some time are familiar with what a demographic pyramid looks like, how it goes in and out based on birth rates over the ages. The boomers are the largest generation we've ever had. They're there in green, nice, big, chunky group. Their participation in the workforce has dominated what we consider normal since the 1960s when they started entering the workforce. So we had a huge labor oversupply because of them in the 60s and 70s. And then we had a huge consumption boom in the 70s and 80s because they were all coming of age at the same time. Now they're leaving the workforce in the 2020s, and we're going to be facing a profound labor shortage. But it's not just about them anymore. Their children, the millennials, are a very different cohort in many ways. But because they're a large generation, they are dominating what we think of as normal right now. Now, there are pros and cons to this, of course. Everyone has their favorite millennial stereotype that they're lazy, that they're entitled, that they got their first job at 27, that they think they're going to be CEO in 3 years, that their mom still drives them to work, assuming they show up, they sleep until 11. All these things, all these things are totally true for about half the millennials. About half the millennials do match the stereotype, and they are an issue. There's no question about that. But the other half do not match the stereotype. The other half did everything that they were supposed to. They entered the workforce immediately upon leaving college. They never took an extended adolescence, and they've worked their fingers to the bone. But from a worker quality point of view, these two different groups of millennials are actually pretty similar, because the millennials who did everything right got screwed. They were coming of age, they were entering the workforce just as the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis hit, which meant that they were the last people in the door. So they were the first people who got fired. And they lost several years of prime, constructive work experience that you normally get at the beginning of your career. They missed out on that for like 3, 4, 5 years. At the same time that the lazy millennials were missing out on 3, 4, 5 years of work experience by choice. So regardless of how you look at it, the millennials today are behind compared to every generation in the workforce that has come before. They've missed out on up to a half a decade of formative work learning, which means they will never catch up. They will always be behind compared to the generations that have come before. Now, there are a lot of them. They are by far the largest group in the workforce today, and thank God they're there. Otherwise, the retiring boomers would generate a pressure that I don't know how we would deal with. So they are contributing, but they're contributing on the back foot, and they will always be like that. Now, there's some other characteristics about the millennials that are worth discussing. Unlike the boomers, and especially unlike Gen X, the millennials have a reputation accurately for being very collaborative. So if there's any sort of work experience that requires multiple fingers in it, especially across multiple fields, the millennials are very good at integrating their diverse life experiences, their diverse work experiences, to contribute to a single product. And in the point in the American economic evolution that we are in today, this is great news, because we are seeing the fastest industrialization process going on in this country that we ever have, even faster than World War II. Part of it's the shale revolution that have pushed down energy costs. Part of it is the millennials themselves, which are now the largest consuming cohort in the world. Part of it is deglobalization, which is bringing manufacturing back. But if you take a group of people like the millennials, who are good at people skills, good at management, good at sharing and contributing, in a time of change, this is exactly what we need. And the only downside about the millennials in this form is that they're not a little bit older. So they're not in senior management, but they can make things work in a dynamic, fluid environment and not get stressed out about it. And that's fantastic. The next generation down are the Zoomers, or Gen Z. These are the kids of Gen X, and they have a wildly different approach to everything compared to the millennials. First and most important is the difference in attitude towards everything, towards people, towards the workforce, towards their jobs. The millennials are willing to job hop. They're not loyal. But Zoomers were raised by Gen X, and Gen X raised their kids with the general idea that you will never get anything from the government. We will always be outvoted by the larger generations, the millennials and the boomers. So you will never get Social Security, you will never get Medicare, you will never get Medicaid. And so there is no point to collaborating with your peers because there isn't going to be enough to go around. You don't simply need to be better than them, you need to be better than everyone. And that generates a radically different work ethic. Unlike millennials who job hop, Zoomers are desperate for an anchor. And so they will cut a deal with their employer to stay on forever, so long as they have a leg up on everyone else. They're hyper competitive. This makes them very productive as members of the workforce writ large, but it also sends them in a couple different directions. First of all, when you're hyper competitive, you don't want to be in a position where your outcomes are dependent upon someone else. So you don't work well with others. They're fairly antisocial, and the sort of mass touchy-feely work that the millennials are capable of and competent at and famous for, the Zoomers just can't compete in that field. So anything that requires a team effort, management, blue-collar work, construction, they just don't do. They just want to lock themselves in a closet and code, which means this next generation cannot contribute to the sort of labor shortages that we're seeing right now in trucking, in agriculture, in upper management, in finance. They're just not part of that scene whatsoever. Think of it this way. Think of the famous fiction we've had in the last 20 years. With the millennials, it was Harry Potter. You fly around on a broom, you play some really bizarre version of soccer, and at the end of the day, you're able to defeat the bad guy, not because you're smart or clever or a good planner, but because of who you are. And then there's the Zoomers. Their show is the Hunger Games. You and you fight each other to the death to see who gets to have lunch. It's a different mindset. Now, this means that there are certain types of sectors that are going to be flooded with workers, that are being flooded with workers. Anything that involves computer science, one-on-one interaction when one of the ones is a machine, technical work, software development, these are booming sectors. These are things that the Zoomers are going to be good at. But if you're talking like the staff for medicine, no. The staff for construction, no. Any sort of management where there's interaction with people, forget it. These guys want to design systems that minimize their interaction with the rest of the world, not increase it. Finally, a few closing comments about the general future of the workforce. So we know that the boomers, the largest generation ever, are retiring, taking their expertise with them. We know that Gen X, a small generation, can't possibly replace them. And we know that the Zoomers down below are even smaller than Gen X. So there is no midterm hope in terms of numbers to fill the gaps that we see. And that the Zoomers are very specific in the sorts of careers that they are after. So they're not going to be able to play a large scale writ large and where we really have shortages. Which means that most of our hope comes from the millennials, but not directly. Millennials, like the Zoomers, like specific types of jobs of management collaboration. They're also not interested in things like blue-collar work. But there is still hope because the millennials are a large generation, which means that their children will probably be an equally large generation. So the hope here for us getting back to something that we would consider normal isn't going to happen in 6 months or a year or 5 years or 10 years. We have to wait for the millennials to have kids and for those kids to enter their 20s so that they can then fill out the workforce. We're looking at 2045. That's the soonest that this situation might improve. So if you're an employer, you simply have to figure out how to get by in this environment because this is probably going to be your new normal for the rest of your career. 25 years is a long time to wait to hire. But as bad as that sounds, and it's bad, it's nothing compared to what the rest of the world is dealing with. Everywhere else, the transition during the Cold War and post-Cold War era, because of industrialization and urbanization, happened so much faster than it did in the United States. And so where we have these wibbles and wobbles between boomers and Xers and millennials and Zoomers, everyone else, it's a much simpler story. It's just a sharp drop off. A lot of these places went from living on the farm to living in the cities in a generation or two. In the case of the Chinese, the entire transition happened in less than 40 years. For most of the advanced world, this demographic collapse is already well past the point of no return. It's terminal. And as you can see with the Germans and the Japanese, their equivalent of the boomers move into mass retirement, there's no one down below to pick up the slack. So here in the United States, we have the millennials as a large generation, which provides us with a ballast now. Insufficient? Yes, but it's still there. And their children will fill out the system down the line. That's not going to happen almost anywhere else. For most of the rest of the world, we are looking at an end of what we understand as a functional economic model. So here, it's painful, it's awkward, and we will grow through it. With everyone else, this is the end of the world that we know. And on that extra cheery note, I hope that everyone has a fantastic holiday season. We're going to have a couple more coming out between now and New Year's, and then into the new year as well. In the future, we're going to be talking about what's going on in Ukraine with the Russians. We might touch on the Iranians a little bit. We're going to do other things with the demographic situation. And of course, there's always something to talk about with China. So everyone, have a drink for me. I'm going to go get some fancy eggnog, and I will see you in a couple of days.